Welcome to the History Max podcast. Today, we are doing a deep dive into a system of human trafficking that operated continuously for, well, over 2 millennia.
Yeah, and this is a really core part of our Eurasian history series.
Right, and for this deep dive, we are pulling from a lot of different sources. We are looking at, historical texts, medieval diplomatic correspondence.
Early modern court registers, too.
Exactly, and some very detailed quantitative demographic analyses. The mission today is to really unpack the mechanics of the Black Sea slave trade. We want to dismantle how the system functioned because, in its early modern phase alone, it extracted an estimated 5 million people.
It is a massive scale, and it fundamentally shaped the demographics, the economies, and the political borders of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the Middle East.
And for you listening, when we hear the word slavery, the immediate reference point is usually the transatlantic trade.
Right, naturally.
But understanding this Eurasian system requires a complete recalibration. The Black Sea trade operated on, well, entirely different principles. The defining factor for enslavement here was not a codified racial hierarchy.
No, it was religious affiliation.
Right. And furthermore, the final destination for most of these captives was not, a sugarcane or a cotton plantation. The demand was primarily for domestic service, administrative bureaucracy, and quite significantly, elite military labor.
Precisely. And, to understand how a system could endure and adapt for 2,000 years, we really have to look at the geographical origins of the market.
We have to go way back.
Yeah, we have to examine how a massive, insatiable demand for labor was artificially created in antiquity.
So let's start with Athens in the 6th century BCE. The ancient Greeks were busy establishing colonies along the northern and western shores of the Black Sea, right?
Yeah, trading posts like Olbia, Borysthenes, Phanagoria, and Istros.
Right. And then in 594 BCE, the Athenian lawmaker Solon introduced this sweeping set of laws. And among the most critical of those laws was the absolute prohibition of debt slavery for Athenian citizens.
Which was a huge shift. Because prior to Solon, if an Athenian farmer defaulted on a loan to a wealthy landowner, the landowner could legally seize the farmer and his family as collateral.
Basically reducing them to slavery.
Exactly. Solon outlawed this practice to prevent a populist uprising, to stabilize Athenian society. But this domestic legal reform created a very severe economic problem.
Because the Greek city-states still operated on an economy that required massive amounts of manual labor.
Right, for agriculture, silver mining, domestic workshops.
It is basically like modern corporate outsourcing. A society enacts strict labor or ethical regulations internally to protect its own people.
But the economic engine still demands cheap labor.
Exactly. So the exploitation just moves across the border. It artificially creates this booming, unregulated frontier market.
I think that is a very apt way to look at it. By cutting off the internal supply, Solon's laws created an enormous external vacuum. The Greeks had to look beyond their own borders to acquire laborers.
So they turned their attention to non-Greek populations.
Yeah, people they broadly categorized as barbarians.
But, the Greeks were not generally marching hoplite armies deep into the Eurasian steppe to capture people themselves, were they?
Yeah.
How did the actual mechanics of this extraction work?
They relied heavily on intermediaries, and this dynamic created what historians refer to as a slaving zone.
A slaving zone.
Right. A slaving zone is essentially a peripheral region where the immense purchasing power of an empire deliberately weaponizes pre-existing local conflicts. So in this case, the Greeks utilized nomadic groups like the Scythians.
Okay, the Scythians.
Yeah, they were highly mobile pastoralists inhabiting the steppes north of the Black Sea, and they would launch targeted raids into the forested zones to the north and west, attacking settled Thracian and agricultural communities.
So the Scythians would capture these agrarian people, bring them down to the Greek coastal colonies like Olbia, and trade them.
Exactly. And we actually have specific economic data on this exchange from the sources. In the late 5th century BCE, a captive from the northern Black Sea was priced at roughly 144 drachmas.
And what does that mean in practical terms?
Well, to translate that into tangible goods, 144 drachmas bought about 624 liters of wheat.
Wait, really? So they were exchanging human beings for basic caloric output?
Yes, along with luxury commodities. Greek wine, olive oil, and fine pottery. The nomadic Scythians wanted the agricultural and artisanal products of the Mediterranean, and the Greeks paid for them with the lives of Thracians and forest steppe dwellers.
And then the Romans eventually superseded the Greeks, but this specific geographic engine just kept running.
It did. The Roman continuation really just scaled the operation upward. I mean, the Romans required a constant influx of labor to maintain their latifundia.
The massive agricultural estates in Italy?
Right. Plus, they needed domestic servants, gladiators, and sex workers. So during the Mithridatic Wars, which took place from 88 to 63 BCE, you had Roman generals like Sulla and Pompey waging these extended campaigns against the kingdom of Pontus.
Okay.
And when the Romans defeated these Black Sea powers, the result was the mass enslavement of populations in regions like Pontus and Bithynia. The sale of these captives directly financed the Roman legions.
And the regional origin of the captive often dictated their specific utility in the Roman market, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Like Spartacus, who was enslaved around 73 BCE. Spartacus was Thracian.
Yeah.
And the Romans placed a high premium on Thracian captives for gladiatorial combat because of the martial reputation of the region.
Exactly. And, it was not just formal state warfare feeding the market. Piracy played a massive role, too.
Right, groups like the Hinayoti pirates.
Yes. They operated extensively along the eastern shores of the Black Sea. They utilized these small, highly maneuverable boats called commorae to raid coastal settlements.
Just extracting local inhabitants.
Yeah, and transporting them along the Euxine Sea routes, which are the ancient maritime paths of the Black Sea, to sell at established Roman slave markets like Delos.
But the classical empires of Rome and Greece eventually fractured and fell. So, if the political entities driving the demand collapsed, why does the Black Sea slaving zone collapse right along with them?
Well, because the underlying economic utility of forced labor remained. It was only the ideological justification that shifted.
I see.
As we move into the period from the 4th to the 12th centuries, the geopolitical landscape is dominated by the Byzantine Empire and the expanding Islamic caliphates.
Right.
And both of these massive spheres of influence develop specific religious doctrines regarding captivity.
Medieval consensus, right? Which effectively dictated that Christians could not legally enslave fellow Christians, and Muslims could not legally enslave fellow Muslims.
Right, that is the theological theory. But practically speaking, both the Byzantine and Islamic economies still required vast amounts of labor.
Right, you still have to run the empire.
Exactly. So by strictly outlawing the enslavement of their own co-religionists, these empires inadvertently directed their combined demand toward populations that adhered to neither faith.
Wait, does that mean these religious prohibitions functioned essentially as a geographical targeting mechanism? Like they painted a massive target on the backs of the unaligned pagan populations of Eastern and Northern Europe?
That is precisely how it functioned mechanically, yes. The populations inhabiting the forests and steppes of Eastern Europe, specifically the Finno-Ugric peoples of the Uralic language family and the various Slavic tribes, they were predominantly polytheistic during this era.
So they fell outside the legal protections of both Christendom and the Dar al-Islam.
Exactly. Theology frequently bowed to pragmatism here. The rules basically necessitated the exploitation of pagan populations. It created a system where religious conversion became the primary, albeit highly conditional, mechanism for an enslaved person to alter their status.
And the linguistic impact of this targeted extraction is permanent.
Yeah.
I mean, the very word slave in English, which derives from the medieval Latin Sclavus, originated directly from the ethnonym Slav around the year 800.
Right.
The Slavic populations were extracted in such massive numbers that their very name became synonymous with perpetual servitude in the Mediterranean world.
It is a profound linguistic legacy. And, the logistics required to move captives from the deep interior of Northern Europe all the way down to the Mediterranean were incredibly complex.
This is where the Vikings come in, right?
Yeah, known in Eastern Europe as the Varangians. They established these fortified trading outposts along the massive river systems of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, specifically the Dnieper and the Volga rivers.
But how did they physically manage that transport? Because navigating those rivers is not just a simple straight shot.
No, not at all. It required intense, specialized labor. The Varangians utilized long ships designed with shallow drafts to navigate the rivers. But these river systems feature severe rapids, particularly the Dnieper rapids. So the Varangians would force their captives to disembark, unload the cargo, and physically drag the heavy wooden ships overland around the rapids.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is just brutal.
It was a process called portage, and it was done under the constant threat of attack from nomadic groups like the Pechenegs. But once past the rapids, they would continue south across the Black Sea to the Byzantine capital of Constantinople.
And the Varangians were not the only group exploiting these northern populations.
Hmm.
You had the Magyars in the 9th century conducting extensive raids into Slavic territories.
Yeah, the Magyars would march captives down to the port of Kerch on the Crimean Peninsula, and there, Byzantine traders would purchase the captives in exchange for luxury textiles, like silk brocades and heavy wool.
So for centuries, the Byzantine Empire was the primary consumer in the Black Sea basin.
Right.
But that dynamic shifted violently in the year 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, Western European armies sacked Constantinople.
The Byzantine state fractured and was severely weakened.
And that created a massive geopolitical and economic vacuum in the Black Sea. So, if the main buyer is suddenly crippled, who steps in to take control of the logistics?
The merchant republics of the Italian peninsula, specifically Genoa and Venice.
Okay.
This era, spanning the 13th to the 15th centuries, is defined by maritime capitalism intersecting with the aftermath of the Mongol invasions. The Republic of Venice established trading concessions at Tana, which is at the mouth of the Don River, and at Sudak.
And Genoa took an even more aggressive approach.
They did. Genoa founded a heavily fortified colony at Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula in 1266.
Let's talk about Kaffa for a second, because it was not just a small trading post. It was a heavily militarized Genoese enclave surrounded by massive stone walls. And the Italians brought highly sophisticated commercial accounting to the trade.
Very sophisticated, yeah.
Where were they sourcing the captives during this period?
There were three primary mechanisms. The first was warfare, drastically accelerated by the Mongol conquests. As the Mongols established the Golden Horde across the Eurasian steppe, they utilized the slave trade strategically.
How so?
Well, if a conquered Russian principality failed to pay its required silver tribute, the Mongols would systematically extract the equivalent value in human beings and sell them to the Italians at Kaffa.
Okay, so that is state-level warfare.
Right. The second method was the organization of localized, opportunistic raids by various steppe factions, just smaller-scale raids.
And the third mechanism is driven purely by economic desperation, right?
Okay.
Families selling their own children.
Yes, exactly. The Black Death swept through Eurasia in the mid-14th century, and it caused a massive demographic collapse. The plague completely devastated the agricultural economies of the steppe.
Right.
At the same time, the plague created a severe labor shortage in southern Europe, which drove the price of enslaved labor sky high.
So you have to put yourself in the position of a starving pastoralist family on the steppe in, say, 1350. The flocks are dead, the trade routes are disrupted by disease, and there's just no food.
Right.
Selling a child to a Genoese merchant was essentially a survival strategy. It ensured the family received the capital to buy grain, and it meant the child would at least be fed, albeit in captivity.
It is a dark reality, and when we examine the notarial registers from Kaffa and Genoa, a very clear gender and destination split emerges in the data.
Okay, what does that look like?
The trade was highly segregated based on the specific labor demands of the buyers, so young girls and women were predominantly purchased by merchants supplying southern Europe.
Specifically places like Italy and Spain.
Yes,
And what were their roles once they arrived in cities like Venice or Florence?
they functioned primarily as domestic servants, legally classified as ancilli. They performed the grueling household labor required by the expanding urban patrician class.
So cooking, cleaning, textile production.
Yeah, and often wet nursing.
But the other half of the demographic data points in a completely different direction. Around 2,000 young boys were exported from the Black Sea annually, but they were not going to Europe.
No, they were not. They were shipped south to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt.
Okay, this is a critical mechanic of the Eurasian trade. Can we explain who the Mamluks were?
Absolutely. The Mamluk Sultanate was an empire ruled entirely by a military caste of slave soldiers. The word Mamluk itself translates to one who is owned.
Right.
And the sultans of Egypt required a constant influx of young boys from the Eurasian steppe to maintain their military supremacy.
But how does a system reliant on armed captives not immediately collapse into rebellion? I mean, you are bringing in thousands of boys, handing them weapons and training them for combat. It seems extremely risky.
It does, but the mechanism for control was rigorous isolation and indoctrination. The boys were purchased around the age of 10 to 12. They were brought to Cairo, housed in specialized barracks, and subjected to years of intense martial and religious training.
So they were completely removed from their past.
Deliberately cut off from their biological families and native cultures. Their entire social identity and loyalty were forcefully rewired to depend solely on their owner. which was usually the sultan or a high-ranking emir and their cohort of fellow trainees.
And then what happened when they finished training?
Once they graduated, they were manumitted, meaning they were freed, and they officially entered the ruling military class.
Okay, so you have Christian Italian republics, Genoa and Venice, acting as the primary supply chain for the military apparatus of the most powerful Islamic state in the Mediterranean.
Exactly.
They're essentially operating as 14th century defense contractors. Genoa is providing the raw material for the Mamluk cavalry, and it is completely divorced from religious or political allegiance, just purely for commercial monopoly.
And, as you might expect, that blatant prioritization of profit over religious allegiance created intense friction with the papacy and the broader Crusade movement.
Right.
Pope Innocent IV issued explicit condemnations, specifically targeting Italian merchants for exporting Bulgarian, Greek, and Ruthenian captives to Muslim buyers.
Because the papal argument is that Genoa is actively arming a geopolitical rival. The Crusaders are trying to weaken the Sultanate of Egypt, and the Genoese are literally shipping them thousands of future soldiers every year.
Exactly. But the Genoese state largely ignored the papal embargoes because the tax revenue generated at Kaffa was just too lucrative to abandon. Furthermore, the Genoese actively used taxation to manipulate the demographics of the trade.
How else?
Well, in 1381, Genoa imposed a heavy specific tax on Muslim merchants operating out of the Black Sea ports.
But wait, how does an Italian colony enforce a tax on Mamluk traders operating thousands of miles away from Italy?
Because Genoa controlled the physical infrastructure of the port of Kaffa. They controlled the docks, the weighing scales, the exit gates. If a Mamluk merchant wanted to load a ship, they had to pass through Genoese customs officials.
Oh, I see.
And prior to 1381, the Mamluks heavily favored purchasing Kipchak Turks, a nomadic group native to the steppe, mainly because the early Mamluk rulers were themselves of Kipchak origin.
But the Genoese tax disrupted that specific supply chain.
Yes, it did. To maintain their profit margins under the new tax burden, the Mamluk merchants shifted their purchasing patterns. They began sourcing captives from different populations that were perhaps cheaper or more readily available closer to the ports.
Right.
Specifically focusing on Circassians from the Caucasus Mountains and Eastern Slavs. And this bureaucratic tax adjustment in Kaffa fundamentally changed the ethnic composition of the ruling class in Egypt.
It led to the rise of the Circassian Burji dynasty of Mamluks.
Exactly. A tax policy in Crimea changed the ruling dynasty in Egypt.
That is incredible. And the sheer reach of these Italian merchants also brought captives directly into the centers of the European Renaissance. There is a documented case from the sources of a Circassian woman named Maddalena.
Right, a very famous case.
In 1427, she was purchased in Venice, and the commercial contract explicitly marketed her as a certified virgin, which drove her price up significantly. She was purchased by Cosimo de' Medici, and she subsequently became the mother of Carlo de' Medici. So the forced movement of people from the Black Sea was directly infiltrating the most powerful political families in Italy.
It was incredibly proximate to European power. The Italian monopoly, however, was fundamentally dependent on the geopolitical fragmentation of the region. And that fragmentation ended when the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople in 1453.
Right.
The Ottomans gained total control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. Over the next few decades, they systematically expelled the Genoese and Venetians, closing the Black Sea to Western vessels.
But the Ottomans did not shut down the slave trade. They just localized it. They handed the operational control over to a highly militarized local state entity, the Crimean Khanate.
Yes, the Crimean Khanate was established as an Ottoman protectorate around 1475, and the geography of the Crimean Peninsula really dictated its economy.
Right, because the land was largely unsuitable for massive agricultural output.
Exactly. To survive and project power, the Khanate's economy became fundamentally structured around the industrial-scale extraction of human beings from the northern steppes.
And the historical records refer to this period as the harvesting of the steppe. This lasted from roughly 1453 all the way until 1774. And the mechanics of this extraction were terrifyingly systematic.
Highly systematic.
This was not a handful of pirates raiding a coastline. These were massive state-sponsored military operations directed into Poland, Lithuania, Muscovy, and modern-day Ukraine.
The quantitative data compiled by historians really reveals the scale here. There are 2,511 thoroughly documented raids that struck 882 different locations,
resulting in the capture of an estimated 3.64 to 5 million people. Just to visualize that data point, The extraction of 5 million people over this period is roughly equivalent to 27.5% of the total population of Eastern Europe around the year 1400.
That is a staggering demographic hemorrhage. And to achieve that volume, the Crimean and Nogai Tatar cavalry developed highly sophisticated logistics.
Right.
Let's look at the mechanics of a major operation, such as the 1571 raid on Muscovy. The Khanate mobilized an estimated 100,000 mounted riders.
Hold on. How do you physically mobilize 100,000 horses across hundreds of miles of hostile territory? The logistics of feeding and moving an army that size are just, well, staggering.
They optimized for extreme speed and minimal supply trains. The Tatars utilized specialized horses native to the steppe that could forage for grass even under heavy snow.
Okay.
They avoided the densely forested areas where cavalry loses its advantage. Instead, they utilized ancient, elevated steppe trails.
Paths like the Woloski, the Zarni, the Kusman, and the Murawa.
Yes, these specific routes ran along the watersheds, deliberately bypassing major rivers and deep valleys, allowing the cavalry to maintain a very high rate of speed without needing to build bridges or cross deep water.
And the timing of these raids was heavily calculated. They would strike during the late summer harvest, when the entire agrarian population was out in the open fields, completely exposed,
Right.
or they would strike in the dead of winter.
Winter raids were particularly devastating. The freezing of the rivers neutralized the natural defensive barriers of Muscovy and Poland-Lithuania. The ice provided a direct, high-speed highway into the heart of the settlements.
And once the settlement was breached, the raiders moved with lethal efficiency. They killed the elderly and the infirm, as they held no commercial value and would only slow the retreat.
Yeah.
They bound the able-bodied adults and children and began the forced march back south. And the economic structure of the Khanate relied entirely on this influx. The state apparatus took its cut directly. 10% of all human captives were taxed directly to the Khan.
Right. And this influx was so massive that demographic estimates suggest enslaved individuals eventually outnumbered native free Crimeans by a ratio of 2 to 1 or even 3 to 1.
Okay, that extreme demographic imbalance poses a significant logistical challenge. I mean, a society where 75% of the population is held in bondage against their will is inherently unstable.
Extremely unstable.
If 3 out of every 4 people in your country are captives, how are you not facing a massive coordinated rebellion every single day? How physically do they maintain control over millions of furious, displaced people?
The key factor here is velocity. The Crimean Khanate did not operate a static plantation economy. They were not holding millions of people in agricultural camps for decades.
I see.
Crimea functioned as a high-velocity transit hub. The captives were brought into the peninsula, processed, and immediately exported across the Black Sea to the broader Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so the merchandise, so to speak, was constantly moving out before any large-scale rebellion could organize or coalesce.
Exactly. The processing occurred at the major slave markets, particularly the former Genoese colony of Kaffa, which the Ottomans renamed Kiev.
Right.
The surviving captives, after enduring the grueling forced march across the steppe, were brought into the city.
And upon arrival at Kaffa, the sorting process was meticulously administrative. Captives were evaluated based on age, gender, physical condition, and potential skills.
Right. Young women were evaluated for domestic or concubine roles. Strong men were destined for the Ottoman galleys as oarsmen. Boys were evaluated for military or bureaucratic training in the devshirme system.
And the financial logistics within Kaffa were highly complex, too. You have Tartar raiders who just arrived with captives, and you have Ottoman merchants looking to buy. How did the actual money move?
It was heavily facilitated by specialized brokers. The records show that Jewish intermediaries, specifically from the Karaite and Rabbinite communities in Crimea, played a crucial role in managing the commercial logistics.
Okay.
They acted as translators, appraisers, and financiers. If a captive had wealthy relatives back in Muscovy, these brokers could arrange complex ransom negotiations, utilizing letters of credit that could be redeemed across borders.
So they were effectively extracting wealth from Eastern Europe without having to transport the captive across the sea.
Exactly. But if the ransom failed, or was never an option, the captive faced the maritime journey. They were loaded onto ships for a rough 10-day voyage across the Black Sea.
Arriving finally at the massive slave markets of Istanbul, like the Grand Bazaar, to be dispersed throughout the Ottoman Empire.
Right. But the societies enduring these annual raids, mainly Muscovy and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they were forced to react. This perpetual demographic hemorrhage triggered a profound era of defensive state building.
Muscovy had to figure out a way to buy their people back and physically stop the cavalry. So let's look at the administrative response first. In 1649, the Muscovite state issued a major legal code known as the Ulazini.
Yeah.
And within this code, they institutionalized a specific tax called the Polonianiki Bor.
Which translates roughly to the captive ransom tax. It is a remarkable piece of legislation because it was a direct, nationwide tax levied on almost every household, specifically earmarked for generating state funds to buy back subjects captured by the Tatars.
But how do you implement a nationwide tax in a pre-industrial agrarian society spread over thousands of miles? I mean, logistically.
It required a massive expansion of the state bureaucracy. The Muscovite government had to deploy census takers, assess property values, and enforce collection through local administrators.
And it worked, right?
It did. This task yielded up to 150,000 rubles annually. The state dispatched diplomats to Crimea and Istanbul carrying these funds, tasked specifically with negotiating the release of Russian captives based on a fixed price schedule.
And alongside the financial response, the physical engineering response was just staggering. Muscovy constructed extensive defensive networks known as the Belgorod and Izium lines.
Right, and these were not just simple wooden fences. The Belgorod Line was a highly sophisticated military engineering project stretching for hundreds of miles.
Yeah.
To counter the speed of the Tatar cavalry, the Muscovites built massive abatis.
What exactly is an abatis?
It is a barrier made by felling thousands of mature trees directly into the path of an approaching enemy.
Oh, wow.
The trees are cut so they fall outward, and their branches are sharpened and interwoven. A horse cannot jump over an abatis, and it is incredibly difficult to dismantle under arrow fire.
Right.
The Muscovites combined these miles of felled trees with deep earthworks, palisades, and a network of permanent wooden fortresses garrisoned by standing armies.
The manpower required to fell those trees and dig those trenches is immense. And you also see the emergence of a new social class on the frontier. The Cossacks.
Yes.
The Cossacks developed as a highly militarized, semi-nomadic society living in the buffer zones between Muscovy, Poland, Lithuania, and the Khanate. And they did not just sit behind the defensive lines. They adopted the tactics of the Tatars and launched aggressive counter-raids down the rivers into the Black Sea, specifically targeting Ottoman galleys and Crimean settlements to liberate captives.
It functioned exactly like an evolutionary arms race. Right. The constant existential threat of the Tatar raids acted as a brutal mechanism for modernization. To survive, these disjointed agrarian states were forced to rapidly centralize their administration, professionalize their tax collection, and maintain permanent standing armies.
And there is empirical data that points to a really profound paradox regarding the economic impact of the raids.
There is, yes. Modern quantitative analysis of urbanization in Eastern Europe reveals a counterintuitive trend.
Okay, what is the trend?
When researchers track the growth of urban settlements from the year 1500 to 1900, the data shows that settlements subjected to raids actually experienced 26% faster population growth compared to settlements located in secure, non-raided zones.
Wait, let me clarify that. The towns getting repeatedly attacked grew 26% faster than the towns that were left alone.
Yes.
How is that mechanically possible? Because if you are getting raided, you are losing people.
It comes down to the necessity of security. The rural countryside became uninhabitable due to the constant threat of capture. Farmers could not survive in isolated homesteads.
So they had to move.
Exactly. Consequently, the population fled inward, concentrating heavily in fortified towns and cities. The immediate threat of the slave trade forced rapid urbanization. It drove the construction of stone castles, the development of urban markets, and the consolidation of state power within those defensive hubs.
So the extreme violence of the slave trade was essentially the crucible that forged the centralized Russian state.
Right, challenging the assumption that the trade only caused economic stagnation.
But all arms races eventually reach a breaking point.
They do, and the balance of power definitively tipped in the late 18th century. Following a series of devastating Russo-Turkish wars, the Russian Empire formally annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 1783.
The Russian military occupied the Khanate, dismantled its administrative apparatus, and effectively destroyed the logistical infrastructure required to mount the massive steppe raids. The harvesting of the steppe was over. But the Black Sea slave trade did not disappear. It simply mutated into a new, highly specialized, localized form.
Yes. With the vast northern steppes closed off by Russian military power, the geographic focus of the trade narrowed sharply to the Caucasus Mountains.
Specifically targeting Circassians, Georgians, and Abkhazians.
Exactly. The demographic demand shifted entirely. The mass extraction of agricultural and military labor ended. The market became almost exclusively focused on acquiring white women destined for the elite domestic spheres and imperial harems of the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East.
Which introduces a massive legal and religious contradiction. Because by the 19th century, many of the Circassian tribes in the Caucasus had converted to Islam.
Right.
And we established earlier that Islamic law strictly forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims. So how did Ottoman merchants legally justify buying Muslim Circassian women?
They bypassed the religious prohibition through a legally sanctioned fiction. The sources describe it as an open secret.
An open...
Right. The trade was formally rebranded. It was no longer classified in Ottoman legal documents as slavery. It was legally termed a marriage market.
Explain the mechanics of this loophole. Because how do you rebrand human trafficking as a marriage arrangement?
The process relied on exploiting the deep poverty of the Caucasus region. Parents living in extreme economic hardship would sell their daughters to specialized dealers.
Okay.
However, legally, these dealers were not classified as slave merchants. They were designated as guardians.
So the dealer claims legal guardianship over the young woman.
Exactly. The guardian would transport the girls to Istanbul, house them, and often provide training in Turkish etiquette, music, and language.
Right.
The guardian would then negotiate a financial transaction with a wealthy Ottoman buyer. Legally, this transaction was recorded as a dowry payment for a proxy marriage. The dealer acted as the proxy for the bride, accepting the money, and legally marrying the woman into the buyer's household.
It is a staggering bureaucratic illusion, obviously designed to circumvent both Islamic law and, increasingly, European abolitionist pressure.
Very much so.
And we have an incredibly vivid account of this system from the sources, from an American journalist named E. Alexander Powell, who investigated the region in 1912.
Yes, Powell observed the physical logistics of this rebranded trade firsthand. He documented how these fictitious proxy marriages were utilized to funnel fair-haired Georgian and Circassian women into the harems of wealthy men as far away as North Africa.
Blatantly bypassing European pressure.
Right. And the system was highly organized, utilizing modern steamships to transport the women across the Mediterranean under the guise of traveling families or apprenticeships.
And the cultural demand for these women within the Ottoman elite was absolute. I mean, almost all the consorts of the 19th century Ottoman sultans were of Circassian origin.
Yeah.
But it feels like historical gaslighting, you know? You read accounts of Ottoman officials defending this practice to Western diplomats, claiming it was a benevolent system. They argued it provided a socio-cultural lift, a ticket out of the crushing poverty of the mountains. Is calling it an apprenticeship for marriage just a cynical diplomatic shield?
It is a difficult question. It requires us to look very closely at the complex nature of agency within deeply coercive systems. The fundamental reality is that this system treated women as commodities and stripped them of bodily autonomy.
Absolutely.
The financial transaction benefited the dealer and the parents. However, the absolute lack of economic alternatives in the rugged, isolated terrain of the Caucasus created a deeply distorted incentive structure.
Meaning the poverty was so severe that entering a harem was viewed as a strategic move.
Yes, unfortunately. For some families, and certainly for some of the women themselves, entry into an elite imperial household was genuinely viewed as the only viable path to social mobility, physical security, and political influence.
So it complicates the absolute victim-villain dichotomy seen in chattel slavery.
It does. It was fundamentally exploitative, but the participants often navigated it as a brutal form of social advancement.
The fact that this unique Mediterranean system was still operating in 1912 is remarkable. But to fully grasp the historical weight of the Mediterranean trade, we have to pull back and examine it in a broader global context.
Right. We have to compare the Black Sea trade to the transatlantic slave trade. The structural differences really define the distinct nature of the Mediterranean world.
Right.
The transatlantic trade was characterized by sustained, massive oceanic shipping, the codification of rigid racial hierarchies, and the deployment of captive labor into highly lethal industrial-scale plantation agriculture.
Whereas the Mediterranean Black Sea systems operated on completely different physical and legal mechanics. It relied heavily on episodic land raids and short-haul maritime routes.
Yeah.
The labor was integrated heavily into domestic households, bureaucratic administration, and the military, rather than industrial agriculture. And crucially, the legal mechanism of manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person, was significantly more prevalent.
That is a key distinction. Historians categorize the Mediterranean not as a slave society, where the entire economic foundation relies on captive labor, but rather as a society with slaves.
Because it sat at the intersection of Europe, Africa, and Asia.
Exactly. The Mediterranean basin acted as a massive receptacle, catching the violent currents of a globalizing world. It absorbed people from the Atlantic, the Red Sea, the steppe, and the Caucasus.
And the individual stories pulled from the archives really highlight this chaotic global reach perfectly. Let's trace the journey of Martino.
Martino's trajectory is almost incomprehensible in its geography. He was a young black boy born in the Danish Antilles, which is an archipelago in the Caribbean.
Okay.
He was kidnapped or sold, transported all the way across the Atlantic Ocean down to the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. There, he was purchased by a Genoese merchant operating on the global trade routes and eventually transported north to Italy, where he was integrated into an aristocratic household.
The bizarre, tragic geography of that is staggering. An African child, born in the Caribbean, shipped to South Africa, ending up in a Genoese household. The Mediterranean wasn't just a local network, it was a giant basin.
Yeah. And then consider the legal complexities navigated by individuals like Bakita. She was purchased in Khartoum, deep in the Sudan.
Right.
She was transported north across the Mediterranean to Italy. However, her owners attempted to keep her enslaved using legal frameworks that were entirely foreign to Italian jurisprudence.
No, haven't.
The Italian courts ultimately ruled that Italian law did not recognize the specific African laws her owners tried to enforce, and she was granted her freedom.
You also see high levels of specialized skill granting leverage within the system. The records from Livorno in the late 18th century detail two men, Mohammed and Huchuram.
Yes, Mohammed and Huchuram were captives functioning as highly skilled masons. Their technical expertise in stoneworking was considered so valuable to the local infrastructure projects that their Italian supervisors actively intervened to prevent them from being exchanged for Christian captives held in North Africa.
So their labor value superseded the diplomatic desire for prisoner exchanges.
Exactly.
And we also have cases of individuals navigating the local economy to buy their own way out. In 1583, a woman named Eva, living in Évora, Portugal, managed to earn a steady, incremental income by baking and selling bread in the city streets.
All right.
She saved enough copper and silver over the years to literally purchase her own freedom, and subsequently the freedom of her son.
These narratives demonstrate that the pathways into and out of captivity in the Mediterranean basin were highly fluid. Whether through religious conversions, state-sponsored ransom, complex legal loopholes, or direct financial purchase, the boundaries of servitude were constantly shifting, making it a uniquely complex institution.
It paints a picture of a massive, churning engine of human movement that shaped the entire region. We started this deep dive in 1571 on the frozen rivers of Muscovy. We discussed how the sheer terror of the Tatar cavalry forced disjointed agrarian societies to centralize, to build massive defensive lines, and to militarize their administrations just to survive.
And the institutional memory of that centuries-long struggle is deeply embedded in the statecraft of the region.
Which leaves us with a critical thought to consider. When we look at the modern political geography of Eastern Europe, the deep anxieties regarding borders, the prioritization of strategic depth, and the intense military culture of the region, we have to ask, how much of that modern geopolitical reflex is still unconsciously shaped by the centuries of trauma inflicted by the harvesting of the steppe? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.